The South is lost until one man refuses to surrender was military reality in 1780, when British victories had seemingly crushed organized American resistance below Virginia. Opens in year when Charleston's fall eliminated Continental Army's presence in South Carolina, catastrophic defeat appearing to end rebellion in southern colonies. Charleston has fallen in May with over 5,000 Continental troops surrendering, largest American capitulation of entire war, eliminating organized military resistance. 5,000, representing nearly entire Southern Continental force, prisoners being removed from American order of battle through single devastating defeat. British control every major city in South, including Charleston, Savannah, and smaller ports, urban dominance appearing to demonstrate complete British victory in region. Only scattered militia remain without coordination or leadership, irregular forces being all that survived Charleston's fall, when organized Continental resistance was eliminated. And one small unknown officer with crippled leg named Francis Marion, who begins fighting new kind of war that British training had not prepared them to counter. With crippled leg from ankle injury making him seem unlikely military leader, physical disability appearing to disqualify him from active service requiring mobility. Named Francis Marion, whose lack of prominence made him invisible to British intelligence, and whose unconventional background would make him perfect guerrilla commander. Begins fighting war based on stealth, speed, and surprise, rather than on conventional European tactics that British expected. Tactical innovation, being forced by numerical weakness, and by terrain favouring irregular warfare. New kind meaning Marion's methods were revolutionary departure from conventional military doctrine, guerrilla tactics being improvised, response to desperate circumstances when organised resistance was impossible, after Charleston's fall left only scattered militia and one small officer who refused to surrender despite British appearing to have won Southern theatre completely, making Marion's decision to continue fighting into act of defiance that would transform how Americans waged war in South. The quiet, unimpressive man no one expected to matter was Francis Marion, whose physical appearance and social status made him seem unlikely candidate for military leadership or historical significance. Marion's frail childhood, marked by small stature and by chronic health problems that made him physically weak compared to robust frontier youth, delicate constitution suggesting he was unsuited for military service's physical demands. Frail meaning physically weak and sickly rather than being strong and healthy. Marion's childhood illnesses being serious enough that survival to adulthood was uncertain. Lack of status in society where military command was typically reserved for wealthy families. Marion's modest background making him socially invisible without connections that advanced military careers. And absence of formal military training from professional academies that taught European warfare, Marion's tactical knowledge being acquired through practical experience rather than through institutional education, make him unlikely hero when examining how physical weakness, social obscurity, and lack of formal training seem to disqualify him from military significance. Unlikely because conventional expectations about military leaders emphasized physical strength, social prominence, and professional training that Marion lacked, making his future achievements improbable. Hero emerging from unpromising background, Marion's later military successes contradicting assumptions about what kind of person could become effective commander when examining his frail health, modest social position, and absence of military education. No one expected to matter because Marion seemed destined for obscurity given his physical limitations and social disadvantages, conventional wisdom suggesting he would never achieve significance, to matter historically or militarily. Marion's lack of obvious leadership qualities, making him overlooked by contemporaries, who could not predict that quiet, unimpressive man would become guerrilla warfare genius, whose tactical innovations would help save Southern theatre. When organized Continental resistance had been crushed through Charleston's fall that eliminated conventional military forces, leaving only scattered militia and one small officer whom no one expected, would revolutionize warfare, through refusing to surrender when British victory seemed complete. The birth of unconventional fighter occurred during Cherokee War in late 1750s and early 1760s, when Marion gained military experience that shaped his later guerrilla tactics. Experiences in conflict teach him hit-and-run tactics through observing and participating in frontier warfare, where conventional European methods were ineffective against indigenous opponents. Hit and run, meaning attacks followed by rapid withdrawals rather than sustained engagements. Tactical approach being necessity when fighting numerically superior or tactically elusive enemies. Stealth movement through forests and difficult terrain, Marion learning how to move undetected through environments where visibility was limited and where noise discipline was essential. And survival in hostile terrain, where knowledge of edible plants, water sources, and shelter construction meant difference between life and death, practical skills being acquired through necessity rather than through formal instruction. In hostile environment, both physically through difficult terrain and strategically through operating in enemy-controlled territory, survival requiring self-sufficiency that conventional armies' logistics did not provide. Teach meaning experiences provided practical education that formal military training could not replicate, Cherokee War being crucible, where Marion developed guerrilla warfare instincts. Him, meaning Marion personally, experiential learning being individualized rather than being standardized military instruction that academies provided to professional officers. Unconventional fighter whose methods violated European military doctrine emphasizing formation fighting and sustained engagements, Marion's tactical approach being shaped by frontier warfare where stealth and mobility were more valuable than discipline and firepower. Birth suggesting fundamental transformation, Cherokee War experiences creating guerrilla fighter from man whose physical frailty seemed to disqualify him from military service, but whose wilderness experiences taught him tactics that would later make him deadly opponent for British forces expecting conventional resistance rather than facing elusive guerrilla commander who understood stealth movement, hit-and-run attacks, and survival in terrain that British considered impassable, making frontier warfare experiences into foundation for Marion's later revolutionary service, where lessons from Cherokee War would be applied against British forces unprepared for unconventional tactics. Charleston falls, army dies, and resistance breaks was cascading disaster in May 1780, when British captured city, along with entire southern continental force. The British victory crushes organised patriot resistance through eliminating military forces capable of conventional operations. Capture of 5,000 continental troops, removing trained soldiers from American order of battle. Crushes, meaning destroys completely rather than merely defeats. British success being so overwhelming that organised military resistance became impossible after Charleston's surrender. Organised resistance requiring coordinated forces under unified command. Continental Army's destruction, eliminating institutional capacity for waging conventional war in Southern theatre. The war seems over in South when examining how British controlled every major city and how American forces had been eliminated through surrender or through scattering into ineffective partisan bands. Seems to British commanders and to many Americans who concluded that continued resistance was futile when military situation appeared hopeless. Over because organised continental forces no longer existed for contesting British control, military defeat appearing to end rebellion in region where British victories had been decisive. Falls through British siege operations that continental defenders could not resist. Charleston's fortifications being inadequate against sustained British assault, supported by naval bombardment. Army dies through capture of entire southern continental force, organisational destruction being more significant than individual casualties when examining how British victory eliminated American institutional military presence. And resistance breaks psychologically when military defeat convinced many Southerners that supporting British was prudent choice after American forces' destruction demonstrated rebellion's futility, popular morale, collapsing alongside military resistance, when British victories seemed to prove that independence was impossible fantasy rather than achievable goal, making Charleston's fall into catastrophe, whose military and psychological consequences appeared to end Revolutionary War in southern colonies, where British control seemed permanent after eliminating organised resistance. Marion refuses to surrender, and forms tiny militia was individual defiance when most American officers accepted defeat's inevitability after Charleston's fall. With barely 20 men, Marion assembles force from survivors and from volunteers willing to continue resistance despite hopeless military situation, small numbers reflecting how few were willing to fight when British victory seemed complete. Barely emphasizing extreme numerical weakness, Marion's force being insignificant compared to British military strength that controlled southern theatre. 20 men representing tiny fraction of military force necessary for conventional operations, inadequate numbers forcing Marion to abandon conventional tactics for guerrilla methods. Marion retreats into swamps where terrain was nearly impassable for conventional military forces, geographic isolation, providing protection from British pursuit while creating operational base. Into environment that British considered worthless, swamps difficulty making them unattractive for military operations, but making them perfect refuge for Marion's tiny force. And reinvents war through developing guerrilla tactics that exploited terrain, mobility, and surprise, rather than attempting conventional operations that numerical weakness made impossible. Reinvents meaning fundamentally transforms how war was waged, Marion's tactical innovations being revolutionary departure from European military doctrine. War that British expected to fight conventionally through formation battles and sieges, Marion's guerrilla methods being unexpected and being tactically frustrating for British commanders trained for European warfare, refuses to surrender despite rational assessment, suggesting continued resistance was pointless when British controlled cities and when Continental Army had been destroyed, Marion's defiance being based on determination rather than on realistic calculation of success probability. Forms militia from desperate men willing to continue fighting when most had accepted defeat, tiny force being beginning of guerrilla campaign that would destabilize British control through proving that military resistance remained possible despite Charleston's fall having eliminated organized continental forces, making Marion's refusal to surrender into critical moment when one man's defiance would preserve American resistance in South through reinventing warfare for exploiting terrain and tactics that British training had not prepared them to counter. Recruiting the forgotten was Marion's personnel strategy when assembling guerrilla force from men whom conventional commanders would have rejected. Slaves whose freedom Marion offered in exchange for military service, African Americans becoming significant portion of his force despite racial prejudices that typically excluded them from continental service. Farm boys whose agricultural backgrounds provided practical skills and local knowledge, civilian youth being trained for guerrilla warfare rather than for conventional military operations. Runaways, fleeing British service or escaping difficult circumstances, desperate men finding purpose in Marion's militia when other opportunities were unavailable. Swampers who lived in difficult terrain and who understood its geography intimately, local residents possessing knowledge about swamp navigation that outsiders lacked. Marion recruits men no general wants, because conventional commanders sought soldiers fitting professional military standards, Marion accepting anyone willing to fight regardless of background. No general wants meaning men were rejected from continental service for being socially unacceptable or for lacking conventional military potential, Marion's willingness to recruit outcasts being necessity and being advantage. But who understands stealth through frontier experiences, teaching them to move quietly through forests, practical knowledge making them effective, guerrilla fighters? Woodcraft, meaning wilderness, survival skills and terrain navigation, capabilities that formal military training did not provide but that guerrilla warfare required, and survival better than continental officers whose European military education emphasized conventional operations rather than irregular warfare in difficult terrain, Marion's recruits possessing practical skills exceeding professional soldiers' capabilities for guerrilla operations, better than meaning superior for specific guerrilla warfare tasks despite lacking conventional military training, Marion's forgotten men becoming effective force through exploiting their practical skills and local knowledge that conventional armies' professional soldiers could not match when fighting in swamps and forests where woodcraft and stealth were more valuable than European military discipline. Living off land was Marion's logistical innovation when establishing first deep reconnaissance unit, operating without conventional supply lines. The first deep recon unit, meaning Marion's force, pioneered sustained operations in enemy territory without secure bases or regular resupply, operational independence being unprecedented in American military practice. Marion's force travels light without heavy equipment or baggage trains that conventional armies required, mobility being prioritized over comfort and over carrying extensive supplies. Light meaning minimal equipment allowing rapid movement, Marion's men carrying only essential items for maintaining tactical flexibility. Eats whatever they can hunt, including wild game and foraged plants, self-sufficiency, eliminating dependence on supply lines that British could interdict or that would reveal Marion's position. Whatever available, rather than depending on regular rations, dietary flexibility being essential for sustained operations in hostile territory where resupply was impossible. And moves through terrain British refused to enter, including swamps and dense forests that conventional military forces considered impassable, geographic advantages allowing Marion to operate in areas where British could not effectively pursue. Refuse because terrain's difficulty made conventional military operations nearly impossible, British unwillingness to enter swamps, giving Marion safe operational zones. To enter for pursuit or for establishing control, British limitation giving Marion freedom of movement in difficult terrain. Deep recon, meaning sustained operations far from friendly bases and without secure supply lines. Marion's unit, demonstrating that small forces could operate independently in hostile territory through living off land and through exploiting terrain that conventional armies avoided, making his force into prototype for modern special operations units, conducting sustained operations behind enemy lines without logistics that conventional forces required, pioneering operational concepts that would later be recognized as foundation for special forces doctrine, emphasizing self-sufficiency, mobility, and ability to operate in terrain that conventional military forces considered too difficult for sustained operations. Strike, vanish, repeat was Marion's hit-and-run ambush doctrine that made his small force tactically effective despite numerical weakness. Hit-and-run ambush meaning quick attacks followed by immediate withdrawal before enemy could respond. Tactical approach maximizing casualties inflicted while minimizing Marion's own losses through avoiding sustained engagements. Doctrine representing systematic tactical approach rather than opportunistic raids, Marion's methods being consistent and being refined through experience into effective guerrilla warfare system. Marion's men attack supply wagons carrying British provisions and equipment, logistics interdiction being strategically valuable for degrading British operational capabilities. Outposts where small British garrisons were vulnerable to surprise assault, isolated positions being easy targets for Marion's quick strikes, and patrols whose movements through swamps made them vulnerable to ambush, British forces operating in Marion's territory being at tactical disadvantage through unfamiliarity with terrain. Then vanish into swamps before British can react with reinforcements or with organized pursuit, rapid withdrawal being essential for avoiding British numerical superiority. Before British could organize response, Marion's forces disappeared into terrain that conventional troops could not navigate effectively, geographic advantages being exploited for maintaining security. Can react, meaning British response time was insufficient for engaging Marion's forces, who withdrew faster than British could pursue, temporal advantage being tactical key. Strike, vanish, repeat, emphasizing systematic nature of operations. Marion's forces conducting sustained campaign through multiple raids rather than through single attacks, cumulative effect being strategic degradation of British control through constant harassment that British could not effectively counter because Marion's forces would attack suddenly and would disappear before British reinforcements arrived, making hit-and-run ambush doctrine into effective strategy for small force operating against numerically superior enemy through exploiting mobility, terrain knowledge, and surprise for inflicting steady casualties while avoiding decisive engagements where British advantages would be overwhelming. The false retreat and circle ambush were Marion's sophisticated tactical techniques, exploiting enemy psychology and terrain for creating devastating kill zones. Marion masters tactic of baited withdrawal, where his forces would appear to flee from British pursuit, feigned retreat, being designed to lure enemies into vulnerable positions. Of baited withdrawal, meaning deliberate retreat, intended to draw British forces forward rather than being genuine flight, psychological manipulation being essential for making tactic work. Pulling redcoats into kill zone through leading them into terrain where Marion's hidden forces were positioned for ambush, British pursuit being channeled into prepared positions. Into area where Marion's forces had advantages through terrain features or through positioning that British could not observe during pursuit, geographic selection being critical for ambush success. And striking from 360 degrees, meaning attacks from all directions simultaneously, encirclement being achieved through positioning forces around kill zone before British arrived. From all directions, creating psychological panic and tactical confusion when British forces under attack could not identify safe direction for escape or for defensive formation, omnidirectional fire being devastating. Circle ambush requiring coordination among Marion's scattered units, whose simultaneous attacks from multiple directions required timing and communication. Tactical sophistication exceeding what British expected from irregular militia. Masters through repeated successful employment of tactics, Marion's expertise being developed through experience rather than through theoretical study. False retreat, exploiting British assumptions that American militia always fled genuinely when attacked. Psychological expectation making British vulnerable to tactic that appeared to confirm their prejudices about American military weakness, but that actually was sophisticated tactical deception, drawing them into carefully prepared ambushes, where Marion's forces would attack from all directions simultaneously, creating kill zones where surrounded British forces would suffer heavy casualties before survivors could escape, making circle ambush into devastating tactic that British training had not prepared them to recognize or counter effectively. Intelligence warfare through spy network, no historian mentioned, was Marion's systematic information gathering that gave him decisive tactical advantages over British forces operating in unfamiliar territory. The spy network meaning organized intelligence system rather than random informants, Marion's information gathering being systematic and being coordinated rather than being opportunistic. No historian mentioned because espionage activities were concealed deliberately and because participants' identities were protected even after war, historical documentation being sparse for protecting intelligence sources. Local slaves whose positions in British-controlled areas gave them access to information, while their social invisibility made them effective spies, enslaved people being underestimated intelligence assets. Farmers who observed British movements through daily activities and who reported information to Marion's agents, agricultural workers being positioned throughout region for providing geographic coverage, ferrymen controlling river crossings where British troops passed, transportation workers being ideally positioned for observing military movements, and boatmen whose waterborne activities gave them mobility and gave them access to information about British naval and supply operations, maritime workers being valuable intelligence sources, provide constant updates on British troop movements through systematic reporting rather than through occasional observations, information flow being continuous and being reliable. On movements including strength, direction, and objectives, when such information could be determined, intelligence quality being sufficient for Marion to plan ambushes and to avoid British traps. Constant emphasizing frequency and reliability, Marion's intelligence network providing timely information that conventional military forces lacked when operating in hostile territory, making spy network into decisive advantage that allowed Marion's small force to operate effectively through knowing British positions and intentions, while remaining invisible to British intelligence, whose informants could not penetrate Marion's organization, creating asymmetric information advantage, where Marion knew British movements while British could not locate Marion's forces despite extensive efforts to destroy guerrilla network through intelligence that local population provided, systematically to Marion while concealing information from British occupiers. Psychological warfare through making 50 men look like 500 was Marion's force multiplication technique, creating illusion of larger army that influenced British tactical calculations. Marion uses noise manipulation through spacing gunfire and through coordinating volleys for creating impression of many more shooters than actually were present, auditory deception being effective when British could not see Marion's actual force size. Noise meaning sounds of combat whose frequency and distribution suggested larger force, acoustic characteristics being manipulated deliberately for psychological effect. Fast raids striking multiple locations in quick succession, operational tempo creating impression that Marion commanded numerous units rather than single, small force moving rapidly. And rapid dispersion after attacks when Marion's forces would scatter into multiple groups, British observations of different groups suggesting larger overall force rather than recognizing that same small unit was operating in multiple locations. To create illusion of massive guerrilla army operating throughout region, perceptual deception being strategically valuable for making British overestimate Marion's strength. Of massive force whose size British estimated based on operational frequency and on geographic distribution of attacks, inflated estimates leading British to commit disproportionate resources to countering Marion. Guerrilla army that British believed was much larger than reality. Strategic deception forcing British to divert thousands of troops for operations against force of fewer than 100 men. Making British believe through manipulating observable indicators of force size, including noise, operational tempo, and geographic dispersion, psychological warfare, being force multiplier. 50 men, representing approximate actual size of Marion's force at various times, small numbers being disguised through tactics, creating impression of much larger army. Look like 500 through acoustic deception and through rapid movement, creating multiple sightings. British intelligence being deceived about Marion's actual strength through psychological warfare techniques, making small force appear to be major military threat, requiring substantial British resources for countering guerrilla operations that Marion's tiny band conducted throughout region, while appearing to British to be extensive military organization rather than being small mobile unit, whose tactical sophistication and whose psychological operations created strategic impact far exceeding their actual numerical strength. Banastra Tarleton is sent to hunt him down, was British response when Marion's guerrilla operations became intolerable nuisance, requiring elimination through deploying elite cavalry commander. Tarleton being British cavalry terror whose aggressive tactics and whose ruthless reputation had made him feared throughout South, British selection of Tarleton for pursuit mission demonstrating how seriously they took Marion threat. The British cavalry terror, whose previous successes against American forces had established reputation for tactical skill and for brutal efficiency, professional excellence making Tarleton logical choice for hunting Marion, chases Marion for days through difficult terrain, pursuit being sustained effort rather than brief patrol, Tarleton's determination to catch Marion being clear from extended operation. For days meaning pursuit lasted at least 26 miles of tracking through swamps and forests, duration demonstrating both Tarleton's persistence and Marion's elusiveness. Through terrain where Tarleton's cavalry advantages were negated by geography that prevented rapid mounted movement, environmental conditions favoring defender over pursuer. Marion, whose mobility and terrain knowledge allowed him to stay ahead of Tarleton's superior force, evasion being successful despite British numerical and tactical advantages, is sent as deliberate mission to eliminate guerrilla threat that Marion represented, British command authority being committed to destroying Marion's operations through deploying best commander available. To hunt meaning pursue with intent to kill or capture, Tarleton's mission being elimination rather than being harassment of Marion's force. Him down completely through destroying guerrilla band, British objective being total elimination of Marion's operations rather than temporary disruption, making Tarleton's pursuit into serious threat that Marion evaded successfully through exploiting terrain and through maintaining mobility that prevented Tarleton from catching him despite sustained effort by British elite cavalry. Commander, whose reputation for effectiveness made his failure to catch Marion into significant defeat demonstrating that guerrilla tactics were superior to conventional pursuit when defender understood terrain intimately and when pursuers' advantages were negated by environmental conditions, favoring mobility over force concentration. The legendary escape through swamp occurred after 26-mile pursuit, when Tarleton finally abandoned chase that had proven futile against Marion's superior mobility in difficult terrain. After pursuit lasting hours and covering long distance through geography that exhausted Tarleton's horses and frustrated his tactical advantages, British commander recognized that catching Marion was impossible. A 26-mile chase being extraordinary distance for mounted pursuit through swamps, marathon effort demonstrating Tarleton's determination and demonstrating Marion's endurance. Pursuit, whose duration and intensity exceeded normal cavalry operations, extended chase being testament to both Tarleton's persistence and to Marion's elusiveness. Tarleton gives up when recognizing that continued pursuit was pointless, because Marion's intimate terrain knowledge and his light equipment allowed him to maintain distance that Tarleton's heavier cavalry could not close. Famously declaring his frustration through statement that entered historical record, Tarleton's words being memorable epitaph for failed pursuit. The devil himself could not catch this damned fox, as Tarleton's reported comment, expressing both frustration and grudging respect. Supernatural comparison, suggesting Marion's elusiveness exceeded human capabilities. This damned fox, referring to Marion, whose cunning and whose ability to evade pursuit reminded Tarleton of animal known for cleverness, bestial comparison, being apt for guerrilla fighter operating in wilderness. The nickname Swamp Fox is born from Tarleton's frustrated comment, sobriquet capturing Marion's character perfectly through combining his swamp habitat with his clever, evasive tactics. Is born meaning nickname originated from this specific incident. Historical moment when Tarleton's words created lasting identity for Marion, whose guerrilla operations had frustrated British elite cavalry commander, despite sustained pursuit through difficult terrain that gave advantage to defender, who understood geography intimately while negating advantages that made Tarleton successful in conventional engagements, making legendary escape into defining moment, establishing Marion's reputation and establishing nickname that would symbolize his guerrilla warfare genius. Cutting British lines until empire bleeds out was strategic effect of Marion's sustained guerrilla operations, whose cumulative impact degraded British control throughout South Carolina. Marion's raids destroy patrols through ambushes, eliminating small British units whose losses accumulated over time, tactical successes being individually minor but strategically significant. Rescue prisoners held by British forces, liberation operations denying British their captives, while increasing Marion's own strength through freed patriots joining his militia. Burn supplies stored in British depots, destruction of provisions and equipment forcing British to divert resources for protecting logistics. Interrupt communications between British posts through attacking couriers and through cutting roads. Information isolation, making British coordination difficult when commanders could not communicate reliably, and force British to divert thousands of troops just to counter him despite Marion's force never exceeding few hundred fighters, resource diversion being major strategic achievement. To counter guerrilla operations that Marion's small force conducted, British commitment of disproportionate forces demonstrating strategic effectiveness of guerrilla warfare, just for containing Marion rather than for offensive operations, British resources being tied down through defensive deployments that prevented aggressive campaign operations. Cutting British lines meaning systematic disruption of communications, supply routes, and isolated garrisons. Attrition strategy being implemented through countless small actions, until empire bleeds out through cumulative effect of losses that individually seemed minor, but that collectively degraded British operational capabilities significantly, strategic bleeding being achieved through sustained guerrilla operations. Bleeds out meaning slowly loses strength through constant small wounds rather than through single decisive defeat, Marion's strategy being attrition through harassment that British could not effectively counter despite committing thousands of troops to operations against guerrilla force, whose mobility and whose local support made them nearly impossible to eliminate while making them capable of inflicting constant damage to British operations throughout region. The Swamp Fox's work makes Greene's southern strategy possible was strategic contribution when Marion's guerrilla operations created conditions allowing Nathaniel Greene to campaign successfully. By time Nathaniel Greene arrives in South to assume Continental command, Marion's guerrilla network has destabilized region through months of operations that had worn down British forces and had encouraged local resistance. Has destabilized British control through constant harassment, making occupation expensive and making British movements dangerous. Strategic situation being transformed from stable British dominance to contested control. Region where British had seemed secure after Charleston's fall, Marion's operations demonstrating that American resistance remained viable despite Continental Army's destruction. Making British control impossible to maintain without committing overwhelming forces that British did not possess. Resource constraints making them unable to suppress guerrilla resistance while maintaining offensive operations. Impossible meaning British could not simultaneously garrison cities, protect supply lines, and conduct offensive campaigns when Marion's operations required defensive commitments throughout region. Makes Greene's strategy possible through creating conditions where Continental forces could operate effectively. Marion's guerrilla network providing intelligence, local support, and tactical assistance that Greene's regular forces required. Possible meaning Greene's campaign would have been much more difficult without Marion's preparatory work, guerrilla operations being essential foundation for conventional operations. Greene's southern strategy, depending on cooperation with partisan leaders like Marion, whose local forces provided reconnaissance, harassed British communications, and prevented British from concentrating forces against Continental Army. Work meaning sustained guerrilla operations over months, Marion's contributions being systematic campaign rather than isolated actions, making Swamp Fox into essential partner for Greene's successful southern campaign that would eventually force British withdrawal from interior after Marion's guerrilla operations had made British control untenable through bleeding British strength and through demonstrating that American resistance could not be suppressed despite British controlling major cities, proving that guerrilla warfare could achieve strategic objectives that conventional operations alone could not accomplish. The father of American Special Forces was Francis Marion, whose guerrilla tactics established operational concepts that modern special operations units would later formalize into doctrine. Closes with core truth acknowledging that Marion created blueprint for Rangers, Delta Force, and Special Forces through tactical innovations whose principles remain relevant for contemporary special operations. Created meaning invented through practical necessity rather than through theoretical development, Marion's tactics being improvised responses to desperate circumstances that proved to be enduring military innovations. Blueprint for modern special operations, whose characteristics Marion pioneered, including small teams, whose size allowed mobility and stealth that larger forces could not achieve. Stealth movement through hostile territory without detection, operational security being essential for small forces operating against numerically superior enemies. Intelligence networks providing information advantages that compensated for numerical weakness, systematic information gathering being force multiplier for special operations. Asymmetric warfare meaning tactics that avoid enemy strengths while exploiting weaknesses. Unconventional approaches being necessary when conventional operations would fail. And psychological disruption creating effects disproportionate to actual force size. Mental impact being strategic objective achieved through tactical operations designed for maximum psychological effect. He fought without credit from Continental Command, whose conventional military culture did not value irregular warfare that Marion practiced. Without rank adequate to his contributions, Marion's modest official position not reflecting his strategic importance. Without recognition during lifetime when his achievements were overshadowed by conventional military victories, historical appreciation coming later. But tactics helped save revolution through preserving Southern resistance when conventional forces had been destroyed, guerrilla operations being essential for ultimate American victory. and shaped American warfare forever through establishing special operations concepts that remain fundamental for modern military doctrine, making Marion into father of tradition, whose influence extends far beyond Revolutionary War, when examining how his tactical innovations created blueprint for special forces whose operations follow principles that Swamp Fox pioneered. Through necessity when refusing to surrender after Charleston's fall forced him to invent new kind of warfare that British could not counter effectively, despite their overwhelming conventional military superiority. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.